Let's dive into chapter 1. Chapter 1 is our foundational chapter. There's a good amount of information in this chapter. So I have broken down these mini lectures, which I will have on every chapter, into smaller segments. As I've said previously, I try to keep my videos about 10 minutes. So we're going to have the first one, which is why we're studying communication and basically the definition, which is pretty complex. And then the second video will be on our communication models, and the third video will be on communicating competently. I'm guessing you've been in situations where the communication hasn't gone so well. Maybe you were in a job interview and you didn't know what to say. Maybe somebody confronted you and you didn't know how to respond. Maybe you tried communicating with somebody and they didn't get the message. Was there miscommunication? You're going to start learning about why sometimes we miscommunicate and all the different factors that affect our communication. So let's start out with why we should study communication. You'll have a section you can read more specifically in chapter 1 on this, but you're going to learn more about yourself and how you communicate. We have the right to freedom of speech in this country, and I would argue that one, a lot of people don't know how to exercise it effectively. And two, there's a lot of censorship and silencing happening in this country right now. And I am all about freedom of speech, but I want it to be appropriate and effective. And so we're going to work on that through this semester. We're always using communication in relationships, so we need to learn how to be better at our communication. Yeah, it'll allow you to be a better citizen. You'll be better in the workplace. And I do like to bring you lots of examples in communication in different situations. What about with your family? What about with your friends, your romantic partner, the workplace? Sometimes your communication is going to look different depending on who you're speaking with. Part of my background was working in a lot of different types of businesses. I worked in an assembly line that was putting together circuit boards, so I was sliding little transistors through the cutting machine to shorten them. I've worked as a receptionist in offices. I've done some bookkeeping. I was a manager of a small restaurant, and I was in sales and marketing for 11 years. I have lots of background with workplace communication and international communication. I worked for a Japanese trading company and for a Fortune 500 company that was heavily internationally comprised. So I like to try to throw in ideas about communicating with different people groups and in different environments. You're going to learn all about communication is to meet needs. And so we have 4 needs that we communicate to meet: physical needs, identity, social, and practical needs. You can read about that in this chapter. So let's look at our definition. I have 2, a short one and then the more complex one. A simple basic definition would be the process of creating meaning through symbolic interaction. The goal is for us to try to understand one another, and it doesn't happen automatically, as you probably will know. Let's get more detailed. Our detailed definition, so you'll find this in our chapter, is that it's a transactional process by which people interacting in a context, we negotiate the meanings of verbal and nonverbal symbols, also known as codes, in order to achieve shared understanding. So I don't need you to memorize this definition, but I do need you to understand the different parts of it. And then it will, I think, automatically make sense. So before we break this down, I want to point out a few things. Communication is a process. It is irreversible. You cannot take it back. It is relational, involves other people, and it is always symbolic. So let's dive into the first part of our definition. It is a process. It is something that is ongoing, it's continuous, it's exchanging ideas. We are trying to create meaning, we're trying to affect each other, and perception, how we view things or see things, does make a difference. We're also influencing one another. Now we'll learn more about communication as a process in the next video when you're studying communication models, where we can dissect it or even like diagram it like we would in English class if you're diagramming a sentence. So let's take a look at, it's a process that occurs in a context. So let's look at context. It always occurs in a context, and when you take a message out of context, it is not the clear message. This is what we have to be careful with in social media, in news clips and newscasts, because not everything is in context. There are a lot of sound bites, a lot of assumptions made without proof, and if you take it out of context, then it's not the accurate message. So there's actually two different parts to context, so let's check that out. We have a narrow context, which is the environment, the time, the place, the seating arrangement, the temperature, whether it's more formal or informal, that's the social context, time, place, all of those components are part of the narrow context. The broader context is different areas actually that you can study in communication. We have intrapersonal communication, which is your self-talk. We do talk to ourselves, and we don't have a communication class on that subject, but that would be psychology. So if you are interested in self-talk, that you take psychology. Interpersonal is communication with two people. It's also called a dyad or dyadic communication. Group communication or task oriented between 3 or more people. Organizational communication is within the workplace or within organizations. It's very analytical. Public communication would be one-to-many or giving a speech, and mass communication is one-to-many, but you're not physically present. That would include television, radio, even books, your textbook, it could be mass communication, social media, etc., are broad context. But when we talk about context, you're going to learn that sometimes we have rules and norms, and sometimes they're explicit and they're obvious, and sometimes they're just more subtle. And so you will learn a little bit about that when you're studying context in this chapter. The next part of our definition is all about meanings of symbols. Our communication is symbolic, right? If I asked you to draw a picture of a tree in your notebook, an artistic ability wouldn't count. Some of you might draw what I call a green fluffy tree. Some of you might draw a palm tree or a pine tree, or I like to call them Christmas trees. I'm a Christmas person. Maybe you drew an apple tree. And each of you might be drawing a different tree, more winter with just branches or lots of leaves. They're all different. Well, that's because you interpreted the word differently. And what you drew isn't actually a tree, right? A tree is actually a living thing outside. That's the actual thing. Your drawing would really be a nonverbal symbol. Or if you wrote the word tree next to your drawing, that would be a verbal symbol. So those aren't actually the tree, those are the symbols. And when we communicate, we're using those verbal or nonverbal symbols, or, as I said, codes is another word. Symbols also can be in your tone of voice, right? So I give you an example of a statement. Sally took Joe out. Sally took Joe out. Sally took Joe out. Sally took Joe out. And each time I said those sentences, I emphasized the different word, as you can see underlined here in the image, and the meaning changed. So our symbols can change based on even our voice. Our goal is to have shared understanding and shared meaning, and so you'll learn a little bit about that. Sometimes that's very difficult. The more you learn about communication, you will realize, how in the world do we ever understand one another? We have different ideas, we have different backgrounds. It gets complicated. So let's dive into our communication models. We will look at 3 different models in this section, and then we will have more insight as to how communication actually works.